Good morning. Good afternoon. Welcome to USJI seminars on the topics of Japan's changing security policy and the Japan-U.S. alliance. I'm Katsuichi Uchida, president of this USJI, and also the professor of law at Waseda University in Tokyo. And first, let me introduce USJI. USJI is a non-profit research organization situated here in Washington, D.C. The USJI was established in April 2009, managed by 8 Japanese leading universities, namely Dosha, Keio, Kyoto, Kyushu, Ritsumeikan, Tsukuba, University of Tokyo, and Waseda University. That's 8. And we are supported by the business societies of both United States and Japan. And the mission of USJI are to promote the policy-related research based on academic data, and to formulate the to facilitate the research among these 8 universities, and to dispatch research results to wider communities through the medium of English, and to formulate the community of the researchers and policymakers. USJI hold week-long seminars like this about twice a year, once in February and one in September. And not only that, we sometimes have a conference in Japan, and so please visit our website in order to understand the activities of USJI. This week, from yesterday and Tuesday next week, we'll have 9 different seminars. We'll cover many different topics. And today's topics, Japan's changing security policy and the U.S.-Japan alliance, is a very timely topic, because since the Prime Minister took office in December 2012, the situation of securities in Japan and surrounding Japan has been changing quite a lot. So I think this is a quite interesting topic, and we are very fortunate to have an expert on these topics. And I understand the Professor Miyaoka of Keio University will give a main talk, and today's moderator is Professor Mike Mochizuki Sensei. And then before introducing the Professor Mochizuki, I would like to to receive their permission, because today's event is recorded, and this is aired simultaneously, and also today's event will be tape recorded, and that will be also open to the public through the internet. So I would like to receive your permission. Is this okay? Okay. Thank you very much. Then Professor Mochizuki, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Uchida. My name is Mike Mochizuki, and I'm pleased to welcome all of you to this event of the U.S.-Japan Research Institute. We're especially fortunate to have Professor Miyaoka back in Washington, D.C. He's a very prominent scholar of U.S.-Japan relations and international security issues, and has been working for quite some time on the U.S.-Japan alliance. His full bio is in the handout, so I won't go through his resume. But then Professor Andrew Oros of Washington College will be the first commentator after Professor Miyaoka, and Professor Oros is well known to you. He has written a book on Japan's security normalization, and is now wrapping up a book on Japan's security renaissance. Right? So first, I'd like to turn the floor over to Professor Miyaoka, who will speak for about 40 minutes, and then Professor Oros.
Oh, Mike, thank you very much for your introduction. And today, I'm very pleased and honored to speak in front of you about Japan's changing security policy and the U.S.-Japan alliance. It's very chilly outside, but I feel at home in Washington, D.C., and also I feel warmness in this room. I'd like to thank the USJI Research Institute for organizing this conference and or seminar. And also I'd like to express my sincere appreciation to the audience for coming to this seminar, which make this event very meaningful. Thank you very much. So let me begin my presentation. So, as Professor Uchida mentioned, Prime Minister Abe took office for the second time in late 2012. Since then, he launched many initiatives in transforming Japan's national security policy. So I'd like to mention some of the most important developments. First of all, the National Security Council was established in December 2013. And in relation to this, Act on the Protection of Specifically Designated Secrets was promulgated in December 2013. And also the National Security Strategy was approved in December 2013, the same month. This was the first time for the Japanese government to adopt a national security strategy for the first time after the end of the Second World War. So this is a very, fast initiative. And also the government made a cabinet decision on 3 principles on transfer of defense equipment and technology in April last year. And also the government made a cabinet decision on developing of seamless security legislation in July of last year. According to the White Defense Paper published by the Ministry of Defense of the Japanese government, this has a historical significance in further ensuring the peace and security of Japan. So today I'd like to focus on the last line of the subject, the last item of this list. And I'd like to introduce you now the developments since the cabinet decision was made July last year. After that, a legislation drafting team was launched under the National Security Secretariat. Then, in October 2014, the interim report on the revision of the guidelines for U.S.-Japan Defense Cooperation was announced by the U.S. and Japanese governments. And currently, talks between the 2 ruling parties are held this month and also next month. For your information, the ruling parties are the Liberal Democratic Party, LDP, and Komeito. If you are not familiar with these 2 parties, just briefly I'd like to explain them. But so the Liberal Democratic Party has nearly 300 seats in the House of Representatives. It has been dominant in Japanese politics, and it is more conservative than Komeito. Komeito is a junior partner of the coalition government. Currently it has 35 seats in the lower house, and it has identified itself as a peace party. So Komeito worries about the kind of result, the impact of their talks on unified local elections, which are scheduled to take place in next April. And also the government is scheduled to submit related legislation to the Diet in May. And also the U.S. and Japanese governments are scheduled to complete the revision of the guidelines by the end of June. So these are the main points of the developments related to the cabinet decision of July 2014. So as you understand, there are two different processes going on in parallel. First, the domestic process of drafting security legislation in Japan. And second, the bilateral process of revising the guidelines between the U.S. and Japanese governments. And these two processes are different and also, can be discrete, but they are related to each other. So, in today's seminar, I'd like to first explain the Constitution of Japan and the Japan-U.S. security arrangements as a background information, but I think I won't spend much time for this because many of you here are familiar with this topic. And then I'd like to talk about logistic support by the Japan Self-Defense Forces to foreign forces. And also, then I'd like to move to the topic of self-defense, including collective self-defense, which has attracted much attention in Japan in relation to the cabinet decision. And finally, I'd like to talk about the impact of the new security legislation on the Japan-U.S. alliance. And through this presentation, I'd like to make three arguments. First, Japan's development of seamless security legislation is a foundation for the review of the guidelines for U.S.-Japan defense cooperation. Second, recent changes in Japanese security policy partially reflect Japan's proactive will to strengthen the Japan-U.S. alliance as much as possible within its constitutional limit. And my third argument is that the claim that Japan aims to become a military power is totally unfounded. So I'd like to move to the first section of my presentation about the Constitution and the Japan-U.S. security arrangements. But I'd like to go through this section very quickly because I think you're familiar with this. So, Article 9 of the Constitution has two paragraphs. The first paragraph is about the renunciation of war and use of force. And the second paragraph is about non-possession of war potential. Okay. Also, I'd like to remind you of two most important articles of Japan-U.S. Security Treaty. One is Article 5, which is about joint defense by Japan and the United States in the case of an armed attack against Japan. And Article 6 is about the provision of bases in Japan to the U.S. forces for the purpose of contributing to the security of Japan and the maintenance of international peace and security in the Far East. So, as you understand, the Japan-U.S. alliance is quite asymmetrical in origin. And since then, there have been some efforts between the two governments to expand the area of cooperation. And one of the first achievement is the guidelines for U.S.-Japan Defense Cooperation, which was approved in 1997. This is the second guidelines. And this document has 3 pillars, so I'd like to point out these 3. First, cooperation under normal circumstances. Normal circumstances means peacetime. Okay? Second, actions in response to an armed attack against Japan. This is related to Article 5 of U.S.-Japan Security Treaty. And the third pillar is cooperation in situations in areas surrounding Japan that will have an important influence on Japan's peace and security. So the underlined part can be briefly mentioned as situations in areas surrounding Japan or CIASJ. So I will use this short term CIASJ quite often in my presentation, so please remember the meaning of this. And this third pillar is related to Article 6 of the Japan-U.S. Security Treaty. And in this situation, Japan is expected to do rear area support for activities by U.S. forces, like supplies of water or supplies of fuel, or transportation of personnel, or maintenance of aircraft, or etc. So then I'd like to move to the second section of my presentation about recent developments in logistics support. When I talk about this, I cannot avoid mentioning the theory of integration with the use of force. This is a very unique theory held by the Japanese government. You cannot find this kind of idea outside of Japan. So I try to explain this to you now. So first of all, logistics support is an activity that does not in itself constitute a use of force. So this is a basic principle of this theory. Second, the Japanese government has intended to avoid Japan from being legally evaluated as carrying out by itself the use of force because its support activities would form an integral part of the use of force by other countries. I'm sure this is a very difficult concept to understand. But in sum, this is the idea held by the Japanese government that Japan should avoid certain kinds of logistic support that may be identified as an integral part of the use of force by other countries. So under this theory, legal frameworks limiting the area of such activities to rear area or so-called non-combat area, etc., have been established in past legislations. Okay. So after the second guidelines for Japan-U.S. Defense Cooperation was adopted in 1997, the Japanese government enacted the SIA-SJ law in 1999. And in this legislation, the government established the concept of rear area, which is defined as Japan's territory as well as the high seas surrounding Japan and the airspace there above, okay, in which no combat operations are being conducted and no combat operations are expected to be conducted throughout the period of activities to be carried out by Japan. So the sentence is underlined, can be summarized as non-combat area. And this concept has made some impact on successive legislation by the Japanese government. And also, the Japanese government put remarks in the annex of the law. This is very interesting. Provision of materials and services shall not include provision of weaponry, including ammunition. And also fueling and maintenance services for aircraft being readied for combat operations. So these items are excluded from Japan's logistics support because of the theory of integration with use of force by other countries. Then the United States launched the global war on terror, and initially the government was considering of applying the SIA-SJ law to send, self-defense forces abroad. But they made a conclusion that, SIA-SJ law was not appropriate. So they enacted two special measures laws. Special measures laws means they can last, temporal period. So they are temporal laws. The first special measures law on anti-terrorism was a temporal law only for 2 years, but it can be renewed. Under this legislation, Japan Maritime Self-Defense Forces had an activity to refuel other vessels of other countries in the Indian Ocean. And also, the Japanese government enacted the second special measures laws on humanitarian and reconstruction assistance in Iraq. And under this law, Japan ground self-defense forces were dispatched to Iraq. But the government chose one of the safest towns in Iraq because, there is a restriction of non-combat area. And there are some common elements between these two special measures laws. First of all, these laws stipulate on support activities for foreign forces, including not only the U.S. forces, but the armed forces of other countries as well. And the second common element of these laws is they used the idea of non-combat area, but also they didn't set a kind of a geographical limit, like an area surrounding Japan. So no geographical limit, so they could send the self-defense forces to Iraq or the Indian Ocean. And this law enables the self-defense forces to go to the high seas and airspace above, as well as territory of foreign countries, like Iraq, after getting a consent of the government. Okay, so this is a scenario in which, this shape looks like Korean Peninsula. But this is just a scenario. So, like country A invaded country B. And maybe the Security Council passes a resolution for multinational forces to do some operations. So this is a multinational forces. Then the Japanese government will do some logistic support for these activities. And according to the cabinet decision of July last year, legislation should be enacted to enable necessary support activities to such foreign forces. But the government will keep the integration theory, so they will not discard this idea. But they have decided to relax the condition for the non-combat area concept. So I'd like to go back to the second slide before. So currently, under the USJI law, there is a strict conditions for logistics support. So kind of two conditions. No combat operations are being conducted, and no combat operations are expected to be conducted throughout the period of activities to be carried out by Japan. So currently the government is considering to erase this part, the latter half. So only the condition of no combat operations are being conducted. So the future aspect need not be considered. So there is more relaxed condition for the Japanese government to send self-defense forces. Okay. And as I mentioned before, currently the Liberal Democratic Party and Komeito are holding talks about this legislation. So I'd like to make some contrasts between the two sides. The one side consists of the Liberal Democratic Party and also the government, and the other side is Komeito, peace party. LDP and the government insist on enacting permanent law, so that they don't need to enact special measures law each time an emergency occurs. So permanent law can cover future contingencies, several contingencies. So this can be considered seamless response. This is a more quick, this can make it possible for Japanese government to respond more quickly. Okay. But Komeito insists on the keeping special measures laws. The government will need to enact a special measures law each time a contingency occurs so that the Diet can put brakes on the government's action. Also, there is some difference between these two sides. That is whether United Nations Security Council's resolution is necessary or not. They take different views. And also, the LDP and the government says they need to amend the USJI law, like no geographical limit, support to the armed forces of the U.S. and other countries, and also deletion of the remarks, which I mentioned a couple of minutes ago. So these remarks will be deleted. So Japanese logistics support can include weaponry or ammunition, and also the SDF can do fueling and maintenance services for aircraft being ready for combat operations. But on the other hand, the Komeito says they should keep the USJI law as it is. Areas surrounding Japan should be kept, and the support to the U.S. forces only, not including the armed forces of other countries. So now I'd like to move to the third section on self-defense. The government's former view on the renunciation of war, as you may know, as a sovereign state, Japan has the inherent right of self-defense. Under the Constitution, use of force is permitted only when an armed attack against Japan occurs. So this is a kind of a concept of individual self-defense. Okay? Individual self-defense means Japan can do self-defense only when Japan is attacked. So Japan cannot exercise the right of collective self-defense, which is defined by the government as the right to use force to stop an armed attack on a foreign country with which the state has close relations, even if the state itself is not under direct attack. So they were the interpretation of the Constitution held by the Japanese government. So under that interpretation of the Constitution, if an armed attack occurs against the U.S. vessels transporting the Japanese nationals, according to the government's former interpretation of the Constitution, unless Japan itself was attacked, the Japan Self-Defense Forces could not defend the U.S. vessels transporting the Japanese nationals. So Prime Minister Abe showed this panel in front of the TV camera that this is a strange situation. So Japan should change this kind of interpretation of the Constitution. So what is the government's new interpretation? So that is, use of force is also permitted when an armed attack against a foreign country that is in a close relationship with Japan occurs. Okay? So this is the part of the right of collective self-defense. But also, the condition is attached to the exercise of the right of collective self-defense. That is, as a result, threatens Japan's survival and poses a clear danger to fundamentally overturn people's right to life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. So this is a very strict condition for the exercise of the right of collective self-defense, partly because Komeito wanted this kind of restriction. So the underlined part is called survival situation. This naming can be changed later. So in summary, you can say that the Japanese government has admitted or recognized the partial exercise of the right of collective self-defense, just partial exercise. So I think the Japanese government should explain this to the United States clearly. Otherwise, too much expectation can occur for the Japanese side. Also, the government explains the reason for this change. That is, the ongoing fundamental transformation of the security environment surrounding Japan. So this is the main reason for the Japanese government to change the interpretation of the Constitution. So currently, in the talks between the ruling parties, there is a kind of controversy or discussing point about this situation. This situation is about an adversary blocks the Hormuz Strait with mines. As you know, Japan depends on natural resources abroad, and they import oils from the Middle East, and 80% of the oil Japan imports goes through this strait. So if this strait is blocked with mines, that can affect the livelihood of the Japanese people. So government and the LDP thinks that this situation amounts to a survival situation. But on the other hand, Komeito believes that economic loss only is not sufficient for a survival situation. that means Japan cannot exercise the right of collective self-defense. So finally, I'd like to move to the fourth section of my presentation, the impact of the cabinet decision on the Japan-U.S. alliance. So as I mentioned before, the interim report on the revision of the guidelines was announced in October last year. And that document says the revision of the guidelines will reflect this cabinet decision appropriately. And also this document says the revised guidelines will detail cooperation in a survival situation as well. So that means cooperation in a case Japan exercise the right of collective self-defense. Also, I'd like you to pay attention to the latter half of this slide. This is a quote from the interim report. So further bilateral defense cooperation will emphasize these items. First, seamless, robust, flexible, and effective bilateral responses. Second, the global nature of the Japan-U.S. alliance. Third, cooperation with other regional partners. Fourth, synergy across the two governments' national security policies. And finally, a whole-of-government alliance approach. So these items are emphasized for the revision of the guidelines, and currently the Japanese government is trying to draft legislation to make it possible for the Japanese government to do these kind of things. So I'd like to compare the 1997 guidelines with the new guidelines. The left column is about the current guidelines. So as I explained to you before, it has three pillars. I'd like to review this. First, cooperation under normal circumstances. And the second, actions in response to an armed attack against Japan. The third, cooperation in situations in areas surrounding Japan. So the scope of U.S.-Japan defense cooperation was relatively limited. Okay. On the other hand, the new guidelines, coming soon, has three pillars, I believe. The first pillar is about seamlessly ensuring Japan's peace and security. Okay. The second pillar is cooperation for regional and global peace and security. The U.S.-Japan alliance has already endeavored to make cooperation in these areas, but the U.S. and Japanese governments have decided to make these cooperations, go further. The third pillar of the new guidelines is the bilateral responses in new strategic domains. More concretely, new strategic domains are external space, outer space, and cyberspace. So these are two new domains in which Japan and the United States can deepen cooperation. So finally, I'd like to re-emphasize my arguments. First, Japan's development of seamless security legislation is a foundation for the review of the guidelines for U.S.-Japan defense cooperation. This is my first point. Second, recent changes in Japanese security policy partially reflect Japan's proactive will to strengthen the Japan-U.S. alliance as much as possible within its constitutional limit. And finally, the claim that Japan aims to become a military power is totally unfounded. So thank you very much for your kind attention, and comments and questions are welcome.
Thank you very much. Mr. Miyaoka for that very clear and detailed explanation of the issues at play now in Japan. Now we'll turn to Professor Oros.
Thank you, Mike, and welcome everybody, and everybody on the internet and in the future archived watchers. It may be amusing to think back at the issues that we think are important in 2015 when you're watching this in 2035 or something like that. But despite that, I want to thank Dr. Miyaoka for an excellent overview of changes under the Abe administration since 2012, December of 2012. As you've seen, a lot has happened, and in a very short space of time. Still, I think that Dr. Miyaoka has shown us quite extensively that there are still lots of rules and norms that remain in place that restrict Japan and constrain Japanese security policy. We've heard lots of acronyms, like USJI is the one I hear a lot recently about situation areas surrounding Japan. Lots of legalism, which in many ways I think sounds a lot like Japanese security policy from 20 years ago and 30 years ago. So the more things change, the more things stay the same, it seems. I'd like to contribute two broader points to put Professor Miyaoka's briefing in a larger context, which I'm drawing from the book that I'm currently working to finish, as Mike mentioned, called Japan's Security Renaissance and the Transformation of Asia. The first point of the two is that although Dr. Miyaoka begins his timeline at the start of the second Abe administration in December of 2012, and I'll just remind you that Prime Minister Abe served as Prime Minister for a year from September of 2006 to 2007, so his second term began in December of 2012. So that's when Professor Miyaoka's timeline begins. But I would argue that the main agenda of what we're seeing realized now was put into place prior to that, and I think it would surprise many to hear me say that actually this was under the rule of the Democratic Party of Japan, or the DPJ, and in particular the National Defense Program guidelines that were adopted in 2010. Now it's true that Prime Minister Abe adapted these guidelines somewhat and readopted them in 2013, but I don't think that there's a substantial change between those two documents. So I can totally understand why you can see how hard Dr. Miyaoka worked to compress all of this change. So I can understand why he chose his starting point. I think that it's an important point because it somewhat suggests that all of this changes because of Mr. Abe. And so I'm not sure that that's the case. In fact, I don't think that that's the case. But I think it's an interesting question to think how much of it is because of Mr. Abe and how much of it might have happened anyway. And that's a question that we might discuss. The second broader context point is, I think, just stepping back and say, why is Japan making all of these changes? So, in the global media, in the New York Times, in the China Daily, I think we might get the impression that it's because of Mr. Abe and the rise of this big nationalist right. And so again, that's something we might discuss, but there is a broader context out there. I'll offer you sort of one factoid that again might surprise some of you. At the end of the Cold War, back before some of you were born, and probably many people viewing on the internet were born, in 1991, when the Soviet Union ceased to exist, Japan was the second largest military spender in the world, right? It spent about 3 times as much on defense as China did. And so now 24 years later, China is the second largest military spender in the world and spends about 3 times more than Japan. That's a pretty remarkable change in 24 years. So it's hard to measure Chinese defense spending exactly, and also the value of the Japanese yen has fluctuated, so that also affects things. But basically, Chinese spending has gone up somewhere between 800% and 1100% at a time when Japanese spending has been essentially flat. That's a very big change in the strategic environment. But it's not all about China. Many other countries in Asia have seen big economic growth, and as a result, they're seeing increase in their defense spending. We see this in South Korea. The story of the rise of Southeast Asia is also quite important, and this is happening in the context of Japan's essentially continued economic stagnation. Right? There's been some ups and downs, and I think that Mr. Abe deserves some credit for some of the recent up, but it's not a substantial up, and so relatively speaking, Japan is declining in relation to its neighbors, and in Asia, the United States also is declining in relation to other Asian powers. So really the story of the early 21st century is a reemergence of a multipolar Asia, and I think the Japanese security policy needs to be understood in that context. Again, this isn't at all criticism of Dr. Miyoka, because you can see he had his plate full from what he showed us. But again, I think that putting that on the plate is important. And then the last thing I'd like to say, more directly in response to Professor Miyoka's remarks, is I'd like to commend his early slide that showed you a kind of schedule for what to expect in 2015. And one aspect of that schedule that I think is important and interesting is how it links to Japan's domestic politics. So I really like that Dr. Miyoka mentioned right from the start, this is how many seats the LDP has in the lower house. This is how many seats its coalition partner has. Again, in the mass media, we often forget that the LDP doesn't get everything that it wants. If the LDP did get everything it wants, then you would think that a cabinet decision that was made about 8 months ago on July 1st of 2014 might actually be in effect. So why is it not in effect? And why are we still seeing a timeline of that it might be in effect in May, it might be in effect in June? It's because the LDP is in a coalition government and its coalition partners don't fully agree. There are local elections in Japan in April, and this is going to have some effect on what can happen in May. So I like that he drew that out, and it's something that others might want to discuss. So I'm going to stop with those three comments / questions and conclude again by commending Dr. Miyoka for an excellent and detailed overview of Japan's security policy and the U.S.-Japan alliance framework. Thanks.
Professor Oros. I was asked by President Uchida and Professor Miyaoka to double up as not just a moderator, but be a commentator. And since Andrew was so generous in leaving me time, I'd just like to say three things in response to Professor Miyaoka's excellent presentation and Professor Oros's excellent comments. First, I'd like to underscore the final conclusion that Professor Miyaoka makes about Japan not becoming a military power. There's a lot written about Japan remilitarizing, but when you look at what's happening, I think Professor Miyaoka was right to say that this is the partial exercise of the collective self-defense. In fact, I might even go further than that, that the July 2014 cabinet decision never says explicitly that Japan can exercise the right of collective self-defense, even partially. If you read very carefully the cabinet decision, basically it's an elaboration of the traditional notion of an exclusively defense-oriented policy, the so-called Senshu Boe, and the right of individual self-defense, and elaborating it and stretching that a bit. And what it acknowledges in that decision is that could be interpreted by some under international law as being like the right of collective self-defense. And this was necessary not only because of the Komeito, but because of the resilience of public pacifist sentiment, also even from the resistance of doves within the Liberal Democratic Party, and resistance from the Cabinet Legal Affairs Bureau. And so when you look at it comparatively, I still feel that Japan, despite the long process of normalization, Japan remains an outlier in the universe of major powers and even middle powers. So in terms of aggregate defense spending, Japan's defense budget may have been large, but if you use other indicators like per capita defense spending relative to GNP, in terms of restrictions on the use of force, capabilities to project offensive power overseas, or the procedural constraints on the deployment of forces overseas or the use of force, Japan is way at one extreme. It's not just that it's on the other side of Britain or France, but compared to Canada, Australia, Germany, and I've been looking at this, even Italy, and of course South Korea. Japan is still at one extreme. Now, this is not to say that Japan is not a very powerful state in terms of individual self-defense to protect its homeland security, but in terms of the use of force and the deployment of forces overseas, Japan is at one extreme in this universe of major and middle powers. And the other thing is that every step of the way, although Mr. Abe has been pushing the envelope, that because of the political constraints at home that Andrew highlighted, that here again we will see the Japanese government having to articulate what in Japanese is called hadome, kind of brakes on what Japan can do so that Japan does not go too far. The second point is the flip side of what Andrew was talking about. Certainly changes in the international environment affected Japan's long-term defense trajectory. But the question that I have then is, given the Japanese response, how then will Japan affect the security environment? Is what Japan is going to do, will that help stabilize the relationship with China because it buttresses deterrence, or does it further complicate the relationship with China because China will see this as threatening, not only because of the territorial dispute, but because Japan could be much more active in terms of some kind of future Taiwan contingency. So, what impact is this going to have on China? And also, what impact is this going to have on Japan-South Korean relations? I mean, this figure that Professor Miyaoka had about what kind of looked vaguely like Korea. Yes, I mean, if you think about the changes, this will have the greatest impact on some kind of Korean contingency. But we know that in South Korea, there's a lot of concern about what's happening in Japan, a lot of mistrust. And I just came back from Korea, and I heard some Korean interlocutors who were quite predisposed to security cooperation with Japan, still made a point that they would like some clear restrictions about the applications of the changes in Japanese defense policy so that Japanese forces would not be on the Korean peninsula during a Korean contingency. So what really is the impact of these changes on the environment? Is it for good, or could it destabilize the environment? And then finally, I'd just like to raise my favorite perennial topic, which is often getting ignored in Washington, but it's the issue of Okinawa. I still think Okinawa remains the Achilles heel of the U.S.-Japan alliance. And right now, the U.S. government and the Japanese government is stubbornly pushing the Henoko plan, despite the fact that in Okinawa there was a landslide victory by a governor who opposed the Henoko plan, and that all four of the representatives in the single-member districts of Okinawa who were elected ran on a platform of opposing the Henoko plan. And so the question is it wise, is it prudent for the Abe government to push on the Henoko plan as it is currently defined, despite the protests that are now taking place on the ground? And is there a danger that this could affect the will of the Okinawa people to host many more important military assets on Okinawa than the Marine Corps? So I'd just like to stop there. Now, I don't know, Professor Miyaoka, if you wanted to give any initial responses to what Andrew or I said, or do you want us to open it up to the floor?
Maybe open up the floor.
So the floor is open. If you could just raise your hand, and then I'll call on you, and you could give your name and affiliation, and then direct your question to Professor Miyako or any of us. Yes.
Dave Fitzgerald, retired Foreign Service. Thank you for your presentation. I'd like to go back to this question of seamlessness. It seems to be a new buzzword, and certainly in a more anti-terrorist security environment, the idea of seamless security seems to be give a false sense of assurance in terms of security. But exactly what do you mean by seamless security? It seems from your presentation you focused only on that there would be this one change in the current legislation which would no longer make it necessary for the Diet to pass a resolution every time there's a new contingency. Is that it for seamless security? Or does the National Security Council in Japan then take a new role as to determining what situations Japan responds in? And it does this outside of MOPA or Defense Ministry. Could you elaborate a little more on that?
So, shall I respond?
Yes.
Each by each?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, unless we start getting a lot of questions.
Okay. Today I explained two, pillars of the cabinet decision, which was made July last year. One is logistic support, and the other is self-defense. Both of these elements are for high-intensity conflict. But I didn't mention two other elements of the cabinet decision, which are one is a cooperation for the UN peacekeeping operations, and the other is I'm going to talk about. So response to an infringement. I skipped this section today for the limitation of time. So these days, the Japanese government worries about gray zone situations. Gray zone situations means situations that are neither pure peacetime nor contingencies, and the situations of infringement that does not amount to an armed attack. So in this situation, in this kind of situation, the government believes that Japan should do seamless and sufficient responses to any unlawful acts, like closer cooperation between relevant agencies, including the police, Japan Coast Guard, and the self-defense forces. Especially currently, the government worries about the incursion, not by Chinese Navy, but armed group. This is an armed group, which Japan cannot identify whether this is state organizational unit or just an unlawful armed group. So this is a scenario in which an infringement that does not amount to an armed attack occurs against the units of. This is a different situation. So this is, for example, this is a Senkaku Island, and an armed group lands on this island. But in order to recognize this is an armed attack situation, Japan needs to recognize this is a kind of a unit of the official forces of a certain country or a state state-like organizations. But otherwise they cannot issue the use of force before the recognition of an armed attack against Japan. So in this situation, the self-defense forces cannot use force. So according to the cabinet decision of July last year, they have found that they need to accelerate procedures for the self-defense forces, public security operations, and maritime security operations. So more concretely, at the moment, in order to do these operations, the cabinet, should hold a meeting, and they need to make an official decision. But now the government is considering the way by making a cabinet decision quickly by using telephones in a case of emergency. So when the government uses a seamless legislation, that means, especially they pay attention to the gray zone situation, which is not pure peacetime nor full-scale, armed attack. So am I answering your question?
Right. What would the Diet be doing then?
The Diet?
Yeah. Are we just going to bypass the Diet, or are we going to keep them informed? I mean, it's similar to where the U.S. government has been working for that.
So prior notification to the Diet is not required for these operations, because they cannot use force for these operations. They just can use limited weapons, like the police does. So, less severe case. So the Japanese legislation doesn't require prior notification to the Diet.
And I'm an intern with the Korea Economic Institute right around the corner. And I know that the Abe administration is very in favor of these revisions to the security policy and the current way it deals with issues like this. My question is, to what extent is the Japanese public in favor of these changes? And what should the Abe administration do to convince them of the necessity of these changes?
Actually, when the cabinet decision was made last July, there are many opinion polls conducted by Japanese newspapers. The results are very astounding or surprising, because each result differs greatly from others. According to Asahi Shimbun poll, many people opposed to this change. But according to Sankei or Yomiuri newspapers, there are more, actually majority of people are for the changes. So unfortunately, there is no objective opinion poll, and the results can change according to wording of questions, and so it's very difficult to gauge. But I think understanding for this change is increasing, in my opinion, because of the current situation Japan faces. And but still, there are many opposition groups to this change. So, of course, Prime Minister Abe knows this situation. So that's why I showed the panel which Prime Minister Abe used. I don't know where. Oh, this one. Yeah. So I think this is a public relations. This is an American vessel carrying Japanese nationals, with a baby in mother's arms, and this boy looks very worried, and so by using this panel, Prime Minister Abe tried to gain some understanding from the Japanese public, but of course some criticisms from the left side newspapers. But so maybe I can respond.
Well, effective is that? Because there are a couple of problems with this. One is that why couldn't Japan just exercise the right of individual self-defense to protect Japanese nationals if Japanese nationals are on U.S. ships that are being attacked? And so basically say this is, we're just defending Japanese nationals. And secondly, it seems that this would be a very low priority mission for the United States if there's a war on the Korean Peninsula, that it would really be the Japanese obligation to evacuate Japanese nationals. So when I first saw this slide, I thought this was a pretty dubious PR slide. So has this really been convincing for the Japanese public?
Yeah. So if you are really familiar with this kind of operation is unlikely or small chances, then you should understand. But I don't know, just a layman or just common people don't understand, and so if Japanese people's lives were threatened, like a situation like this, and so Japan should do something. But personally, I have not asked anybody in Japan, so I cannot answer your question. But this case, this ship carries Japanese nationals, but this attack does not constitute an armed attack on Japan. So Japan cannot exercise individual collective self-defense in this situation. So that's why the government tries to expand the concept of self-defense by showing this kind of a slide or a panel. But
no, I don't mean you're not. Please.
Okay. But as Professor Mochizuki said, this is quite unlikely because priority for the U.S. government to carry Japanese nationals is very low. So, but this is a kind of their efforts to get understanding from the Japanese public.
This in a even more contemporary light, since this was a slide used in June of last year, but I was in Japan just last week, and it was immediately after the unfortunate beheading of Japanese nationals in the Middle East by the so-called Islamic State, and this issue then once again, of course, became a big media issue in terms of how should Japanese nationals in the Middle East be best protected, and does Japan have sufficient capabilities, for example, to evacuate Japanese nationals in a case of an emergency or to rescue hostages. And my read of both the public opinion polling and the types of debates that were going on across the different Japanese newspapers is similar to what Dr. Miyoka mentioned happened last year, which is that it depends a lot on the publication that you're looking at. But I think that what links to Dr. Miyoka's earlier comments, which deserves underscoring, is that and also actually Dr. Mochizuki's comments about the difference between homeland defense and power projection. But there's an overlap naturally between the ability to protect Japanese nationals on the Korean Peninsula, if that's what that is, but certainly in the Middle East as well, to have capabilities that you could, effectively fight a force halfway around the world and evacuate those citizens. And it just seems to me that there's very little appetite within the Japanese public to develop those kinds of capabilities. That's quite different than protecting the homeland. And it's also not at all a new issue. I mean, those of you who have been following these issues for a while, all the way back in the 1990s, Japanese hostages had been taken, the ambassador's residence in Lima had been taken over, and it led to a quick reaction in the press saying we should do something, but now here you are, 20 years later, not a lot's been done.
It's understandable.
What is your name?
My name is Suzuki of CSIS. It's understandable that today Japanese faces some kind of risk or some threat to revise today's construction. But probably in this division, there's two purposes. One is for peace for world peace. And the second purpose is probably surrounding risk, especially China or Korea Peninsula. So it's a little bit complicated for general Japanese to understand world peace and some kind of Chinese threat. So we have to separate the situation between China and world peace. How do you think about it? It's not understandable for general Japanese.
Right.
Which is our purpose? Threaten against China or world peace?
Right. Yes, of course. I think the cabinet decision, which was made July last year, was very difficult for the common person to understand. But the government tries to sort out, different activities into 4 main areas in the cabinet decision. So one is, one is a self-defense, and also a response on infringement, which I just explained before. So these 2 categories belong to the peace and security of Japan. And the other category is international peace and stability. And logistic support is mentioned mainly for this purpose, and also UNPKO for this purpose. But actually, discreetly, the government is considering expanding the logistic support to cover peace and security of Japan too, by amending the USJI law. So I think this is the current kind of a sort out by the Japanese government. And,
Thank you all for being with us. I'm Charles Heck. I'm a fellow at the Center for Transatlantic Relations at SAIS. There are people in and around the Abe administration who still spend a lot of time talking about historical issues, about comfort women, et cetera, et cetera. Are you worried that this discussion of historical issues will undermine the sort of very constructive and appropriate narrative that I think you all have provided for these changes? And then a second question, perhaps, how important do you think the August 15th statement that the Prime Minister will make is in this regard, and what would you ideally hope that he would say on that 70th anniversary time?
Right. First of all, I understand that the Washington Post covers, statements by Prime Minister quite well. So, so not only New York Times, but also the Washington Post pay attention to, what Prime Minister Abe says in relation to the historical issues. So, I think their editorials makes a kind of political environment in which people in Washington D.C. pay attention to the Prime Minister's statement coming next August 15th. Especially people will pay attention to the same expressions will be used again in the coming statement, like colonial rule and aggression, or deep remorse and heartfelt apology. These expressions were used in the Murayama statement in the mid-1990s. Then Prime Minister Koizumi also issued a statement which uses exactly the same expressions. And actually the press pay attention to these expressions and so forth. So I think world attention will be paid to whether Prime Minister Abe will repeat these expressions again or not. But so far, the Prime Minister Abe has mentioned that his government will succeed the Murayama statement as a whole. As a whole, that means, generally speaking, they will accept the main tone of the situation. But on the other hand, that kind of a statement says that they will not use the same expressions exactly. So personally, I'm not in the government, so personally as a scholar, I'd like to pay attention to whether Prime Minister Abe will, how to handle this problem.
Steve Winters, Washington-based researcher. You covered so much material, and it's so hard to formulate a question, but I'm going to try to make it really simple. I've heard some leading Korean figures make this statement, that we can understand why certain elements of the limitations on protecting Japanese nationals or whatever, Japanese peacekeepers overseas, need to be changed, or it makes sense to change it. But what worries us is that the government that is changing them is also the same government which is perceived in other countries as increasing nationalism in Japan. All those debates are the history debates, and I think this is perhaps reaching a crisis point now with the Emperor's New Year's statement and now the Crown Prince's birthday statement. So this is not, just some newspaper or left thing. How do you see the connection of those two things, increasing nationalism and then this revision of the guidelines?
Okay. I think nationalism is closely related to the historical issue in Japan. But this is more security-oriented changes, I believe. But from the eye, for the eye of the common people, these security-related changes can be linked to the historical statements by Japanese politicians or so. So I think personally I believe that historical negative statements can affect the impression of the Japanese security changes as a negative steps. But fortunately, for example, Washington Times editorial makes a difference between security policy changes and also Abe cabinet's historical issues. But I'm not sure whether just the common people can make such a distinction between the two very objectively. So personally, for a political reason, I think the Japanese government should kind of restrain their statements about historical issues.
I just want for Professor Oros to address this difficult question.
Well, I actually agree very much with my former office mate at GW when we were working on these issues 10 years ago. It's a useful distinction to make, I think, between the security policy changes and the history issues. I guess in just a few lines, I would add that if you want to read in, I guess it's mostly in Japanese, but you can see some summaries in English about what kinds of issues that the people that I think most people would consider the rightist nationalists in Japan, which are, I would consider a small percentage of the Japanese public, but they're quite active and vocal. And these days with social media, even in the U.S., you can easily see what they're writing if you can read Japanese. I don't think that you see much evidence that they're interested in beefing up the capabilities of the self-defense forces or reinterpreting the right of collective self-defense. I mean, these are just not issues that if you were to do like keyword searches, you just wouldn't see these as priority issues for rightist nationalists in Japan. If anything, the kinds of, if they're related at all to broader security policy issues, I think the kinds of things that you see them advocate for are like renaming the self-defense forces to sort of national security forces, or it's hard to translate into English, revising the Constitution to address issues related to national pride, for example, getting past what the phrase that Prime Minister Abe used to use and tends to avoid now about destroying the legacy of the post-war regime that was quite controversial because it implies that the San Francisco Peace Treaty was somehow flawed or should be revisited. I mean, these are the kinds of issues that the rightist nationalists want to see happen. So I guess what I would say is if you think that the Abe government is strongly influenced by this group, then it seems like the kinds of security policies you would see as a result would be quite different than the policies that you actually see.
Well, I take a somewhat different cut at this from both Professor Miyaoka and Professor Oros. Yes, I certainly agree with both of you that the Japanese government would like to separate out history and security. But in the reality of international politics in East Asia, the two are linked. And we've seen in history how much perceptions and mistrust can exacerbate security dilemmas. And so the Japanese themselves may have a perception that these are very modest changes and Japan is still a peace-loving state, but the Chinese or the Koreans, rightly or wrongly, have a very different view. Now, it's not to say that Japan is all to blame for this mistrust. There's a lot that China's doing that generates this mistrust, but it seems that you really need a two-way dialogue on this, and I certainly hope that Mr. Abe is pragmatic enough so that he doesn't exacerbate the problem, and I do hope that he goes the further step in promoting reconciliation. I mean, having a future-oriented diplomacy is all good and fine, but part of that is that Japan will always remember the lessons of history and will promote reconciliation from a humble kind of attitude, and that's what Prime Minister Murayama did, and I certainly hope that Mr. Abe continues that.
Yeah. I totally agree with you.
Yeah. Okay.
Can I add one? I think.
Yeah.
Professor Mochizuki essentially returned to the previous question. I just want to make a comment on the previous question about the 70th anniversary statement and what should be included. Again, largely agreeing with Dr. Miyaoka, but here I agree with Dr. Mochizuki. However, in my own personal view, I think that Japan, under Mr. Abe and also in the past decade, has seemingly retreated from stressing the kinds of contributions Japan has made to international peace and security in the past 70 years. And I think that it would be a mistake for observers to say that the statement should only be focused on Japan's recognitions that it did bad things in the past and its remorse for the past. I think that it would be appropriate for Japan at the 70th anniversary to stress that it isn't just about words, it's about deeds, and the fact that Japan has never deployed its military forces abroad in 70 years, that no member of the self-defense forces has been even injured in combat in 70 years, is, I think, the biggest the biggest indication that Japan has substantially changed since the wartime period. Very few countries can point to that, and certainly the countries that most criticize Japan can't point to such a constructive international role in the last 70 years. It's not to absolve the rightists and the problems that Mr. Abe has with wartime history, but I do think it's appropriate to stress what kind of country Japan has become, which is in fact a model country for many countries in the world. Even if you want to criticize what Japan has done, many countries have modeled their democracy and their security practices on Japan's post-war example.
So I have a question related to current Japanese security posture. So Japan currently has, I believe that Japan currently has quasi-power projection capabilities such as Izumo-class helicopter carriers or special forces who are specifically trained for amphibious operations. What would be the legal and doctrinal basis for this kind of development, and where is Japan heading with these kind of capabilities?
So the government believes that these developments of capabilities is for the defense of Japan. So of course the constitution prohibits Japan to have offensive weapons like an aircraft carrier or intercontinental ballistic missiles. Of course, helicopter, kind of a craft carrier can be a kind of a borderline, but still it is useful for the defense of Japan and also for the rescue of Japanese nationals from natural disasters, and so there's no much controversy in introducing such kind of defense equipments, as far as I know.
We're at a time period, but I just want to give two other people a chance to ask the last questions, Professor Asano and Mindy Collar.
previous in Withdrawal Center. Another question about third pillar of the new guideline. You mentioned enhancing the domain of security issues to cyberspace and cosmos. And in order to think about the extent and the extent of the transformation of Japanese security, I guess it's very important for American audience to think about the third issue, or the very gray zone issue. That means following the rescue of Japanese nationals in the American gunboat and sweeping the mines in the Hormuz Strait. I guess it's two gray zone issues, as you mentioned. And it might be related with collective security. But the third issue, for the most important one, is attacking to the North Korea's long-range missile, which goes to Seattle or Chicago, and whether Japan can attack to the long-range missile over the Japanese archipelago. It's a very, very problematic issue. Whether Japan is really transforming itself to somewhat unknown countries, or whether Japan is still maintaining the idea of the Article 9 is depend on this issue, I guess. Yeah. So I want to Professor Miyaoka to answer this question, whether this might be included in the new enhancement of the Japanese self-defense force activities. Yeah, not direct attack on Japan, but somewhat collective activities related to issues.
Okay. Mandy, if you your question, and then no.
These history issues, I think, may be more integral to security. Don't you think that all these convoluted reasons why Japan cannot do certain security measures throughout the last 70-some years, and the convoluted reasons now where you have to go through a cabinet decision as opposed to a whole vote by the Diet, all end up back at history. And part of all the noise going on now regarding the 70th statement, the Murayama statement was very imperfect. And in fact, Mr. Abe walked out of the vote in the Diet. So we're sort of being forced to accept a secondary statement where there really wasn't an official apology per se.
So I guess that was rather than a question. Okay, what do you want to answer, Professor Asamo's question?
So, missile defense, missile defense, the use of missile defense system to shoot down the ballistic missiles flying over Japan to the United States is one of the big issues for concerning the exercise of the right of collective self-defense. So, before the cabinet decision was made, July last year, the government submitted 15 scenarios in which Japan can change the kind of way of using force or weapons, and 2 or 3 scenarios are related to the missile defense. So the United States and Japan have already started to further cooperation in this field. So I think this aspect will be included in the cabinet decision. In the security legislation, and I think cooperation will go further. So that's my short.
So it is included in the concept of minimum required defense.
No, this is if ballistic missile will launch to the United States as an ally of Japan, that will constitute a survival issue or survival situation. Then the government will be able to exercise the right of collective self-defense. So that's my understanding.
I think, unfortunately, we're out of time. Thank you very much for your great questions and comments, and please join me in thanking Professor Miyaoka and Professor Oros for their terrific presentations and comments.